Hey, my love, before we get into this episode, I want to let you know this episode is sponsored by our brand new partner, BetterHelp. You all know I'm an advocate for therapy. You all know I could not sit in front of you every single week and do this if I did not go to therapy and am not in therapy myself. And what I love about BetterHelp is that they make therapy affordable, convenient, and accessible for everyone. They have a therapist for anybody and everybody who is in their grieving journey, no matter what stage of the grieving journey you're at. They have over 20,000 professional therapists that you can choose from. And all you have to do is literally answer a questionnaire. In under 48 hours, you will be matched with a therapist that is unique to you. You can do it straight from your phone or computer. You can even text your therapist, which is amazing when you're having a rough day. And because you're a listener of This Too Shall Suck podcast, you're going to get 10% off your already affordable month of therapy. All you have to do is go to www.betterhelp.com/. This too shall suck. Again, that's www.betterhelp.com/ this too shall suck. You're going to get 10% off your first month of therapy. You all listen, you have to go to therapy. It is literally going to change your life. And let's get into today's episode. Now something else happens. The world happens. All of this stuff with Black Lives Matter happens. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all these deaths that are happening, then all these mass shootings. Like, we're just accumulating this grief on top of each other, 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 and we're never processing it. And that's how grief can be dangerous. And it's okay for you to process a collective grief, even if it didn't specifically happen to you. Welcome to This Too Shall Suck podcast, a fresh perspective on grief. I'm Loryn Denise, just your average millennial out here trying to have a conversation about a taboo topic that nobody wants to talk about. It's important to know that grief doesn't just happen when you lose someone. It can happen at any moment in your life. And it doesn't have to be all bad. It can actually be a really beautiful process. And as a millennial who had to process her own grief, I knew it was important to bring a more lighthearted, fresh perspective and create a safe space to discuss a topic that is typically uneasy. As I always like to say, we like to talk about the real of grief, the whole grief, and nothing but the grief. This Too Shall Suck podcast, a fresh perspective on grief, starts now. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Welcome back, you guys, to another week's episode. This is your first time here. Welcome, 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 welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. If this is not your first time here, welcome back. Again, y'all know I love each and every one of you for being here. Before we dive in, of course, again, if this is your first time, welcome to the family that none of us has to be a part of, but we are all trying to heal from. If, again, you are not, again, just welcome back. And I want to ask you a favor. I want to ask you, if you don't mind, rate, reviewing, and following on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because what that does is that allows me to get this message about grief out here. We are all in this journey, just trying to heal, be our best selves, define ourselves inside of our grief, not the other way around. And by you all doing that, that allows me to continue to get this journey out here, to get it out to the person who's a you or who's a me who does that. I'm dropping episodes weekly. I have some new content coming up. And so that just allows me to do that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And when you do, shoot me a message either on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or an email and let me know so I can personally thank you. I want to personally thank you for just doing that. Even though it seems like a very small gesture to you, it means the absolute world to me. So before we dive in, I just wanted to ask of that and to thank you in advance. And for everyone who's done it already, thank you so much. I love you so much. So today, it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of research, and so I was trying to figure out how I wanted to frame this episode. But basically, I want to talk about how one type of grief can lead into a different type of grief. So basically how grief can lead into grief almost type of situation, because I'm going to be diving into 3 different type of griefs, because I think it's really important right now with everything that's going on in the world, not just necessarily in the U.S. Of course, obviously, I live here in the U.S. and North Carolina, but there's so much going on in the world, a lot of grief that we're all experiencing, that I wanted to touch on that and help you understand maybe what you're feeling and how to give you some tips on how to work through that. Because, maybe you're like, this is a weird type of grief, or maybe this grief that you're experiencing as a whole, which I'll get into as well, is maybe bringing up some other type of grief in your life that, maybe you weren't able to fully process or you thought you processed and it's being brought back up. So, really just grief, how grief can lead into grief. Or how grief can bring up more grief. How grief can cause grief. How grief can cause grief, y'all. It's real life. So y'all know I got my papers right here, okay? I'll be doing research. Listen, I don't know if y'all just think I'll be up here, okay? But I really do research because I really want to make sure that we all have a clear understanding. I want to make sure that I'm giving you all everything you need in order for you to grow and to be your best self. And so I'm going to tie them all together and then I'm going to give you some tips on how we can all work through it together because at the end of the day, no grief is the same, or no one's grieving journey, excuse me, is the same. But there are some ways that we can collectively work together to really help each other in our grieving journey. And so the first type of grief that I want to talk about that you probably are experiencing is something called a collective grief. I shared it on my social media a little while ago after the school shooting here in Texas. And it was 10 days after a Buffalo shooting at a grocery store. And so there was a lot of heaviness that everyone was feeling, obviously, like shooting at an elementary school, right? But then we just came off another mass shooting here in the US. And so there was this weird feeling of heaviness that not only that I felt, that a lot of people, like a lot of my friends who I was talking to, a lot of people who I saw online were feeling, and they're like, why am I feeling this grief? Like, I didn't know anyone in the grocery store. I didn't know anyone in the elementary school. I don't know anyone attached or tied to that, but I feel this heavy feeling. And so what collective grief is, it's when a community, society, village, or nation all experiences extreme change or loss. Essentially, we all were feeling a sadness and a loss from not only the supermarket mass shooting in New York, or Buffalo, in Buffalo, New York, which is 10 days prior to this mass shooting at an elementary school, right? And so, like, as a community, as a society, we all were feeling this loss, this heaviness, and an extreme change. And we were kind of like, man, like, why am I feeling this way? Again, I'm not associated with anyone at that school. I'm not associated with anyone at that supermarket, but we all were feeling some type of way. Like, it was a heavy day the next day after that I'll say specifically after the elementary school shooting. And so what happens with collective grief, what that does is that leads to another type of grief, which I've touched on before, I believe maybe in like season 1, or I know I put it on my social media for sure, but it's called anticipatory grief, which the definition of anticipatory grief is the feeling we get when we preemptively mourn. So what that means is, for example, right? So the Buffalo shooting at the grocery store. So we know here that the gun laws, like, a lot of people are like, yo, the gun laws need to change. Like, this is crazy. Like, people are going getting guns, shooting up schools, shooting up grocery stores, shooting up churches, right? And so we're just really anticipating that next thing to happen because we haven't seen any change. We haven't seen any change since the shooting in is it Parkland shooting, elementary school shooting in Florida some years ago. We didn't see any changes, right? And so we're just anticipating and just waiting on the next thing to happen. Now, did we know it was going to happen so soon? 10 days after, again, the Buffalo shooting? No, we didn't, but we were anticipating that. And so that causes another grief inside the collective grief you're already having, right? So imagine this, you're having a collective grief, even if you're not attached to them, you have some type of grief, you're feeling some type of grief, you're feeling some type of way about this Buffalo shooting. So you're anticipating, like, okay, we're just waiting for the next mass shooting. And then 10 days later, there's an elementary school shooting. So not only do you have this collective grief, you've now anticipated this grief because you already know, like, there wasn't changes made in 10 days. So of course we were anticipating this grief. And now it's going to lead into this other grief that I'm talking about here in a second, which I'll get into. But something that I found really interesting as I was researching is it said when communities start to experience collective anticipatory grief together, that feeling of being out of control can become stronger than ever. Because here's the reality of it: when you experience a loss of some sort, again, whether it's the loss of a human, whether it's a job, whether it's a divorce, whatever it is, right? That is a feeling that you typically process on your own because it happened directly to you, right? And then, obviously if you bring others in, you're able to talk to them, that's different. But if we're collectively grieving as a nation, which we are, if we're collectively grieving as a world because of the pandemic, which we are, right? We usually are in tune. We're usually only in tune with our own feelings, right? We're usually only in tune with, okay, well, this is how I feel, right? Now, now you're linked to others, right? Who are into, and you become in tune with other people's processes because we're all have this heavy feeling. And so that's a really, 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 really strong feeling of grief, right? Because again, you're typically just in tune with, how do I feel after this loss? How do I feel after this divorce? How do I feel after losing my mom? How do I feel after losing my dad? How do I feel after losing this job, this relationship, right? As opposed to now, it's, how do I feel, but how does the world feel? Because I can feel this heaviness in the world, right? So that can be really strong and really powerful, and sometimes I guess the word I'm looking for is sometimes overwhelming and scary, right? Because again, you're typically in tune with your own feelings, but now I'm in tune with the processes of others who are going through their own grieving and journey, because we're all feeling this collective grief. So it could be, man, it could be, again, powerful, it could be scary, and it could be like, I don't know if I even have time to process my own grief because I'm feeling the grief of so many other people, which kind of leads to the other grief that I wanted to touch on, which is called cumulative grief. And so basically what cumulative grief is when you don't have time to process one loss before incurring another. So again, going back to the Buffalo situation, right? Going back to the Buffalo situation, and then 10 days later is an elementary school situation. Now, not only have you not had time to process what happened there, and you have this collective grief, and you're anticipating this, you're anticipating something else to happen. So you have this anticipatory grief. Now it happened so quick, you didn't have time to process the other one. So now you have a cumulative grief, right? You see how crazy it is? Like, you have a collective grief as a nation. You're anticipating that next grief. You're just waiting for it to happen. And then it happens so soon that you didn't even have time to process the other one. So now it's a cumulative grief. Do you see how powerful grief can be, man? Like, listen, I know people are not out here talking about grief like this, and they're probably not like, what? Like, Loryn, what? Listen, it is crazy how grief just continues to tie into each other and continues to evolve and form depending on what's going on in the world and in your world specifically, right? And so, again, when you don't have that time to process, that brings it to that cumulative grief. And so that's when it comes into rapid of a succession for you to heal from the initial loss. So again, we're already like, man, like, we lost all these people in the grocery store. We had this mass shooting, and then we know these laws aren't going to change. So when's the next mass shooting? And then 10 days later it happens. It comes so quick. You're like, yo, I didn't even like get a chance to process what happened 10 days ago. And then now you want me to process something else 10 days later? Send help. No, for real, like, send help. And the reason why cumulative grief is so heavy and can be so strong outside of the collective grief, outside of the anticipatory grief, is because no two losses are the same, right? No two losses feel the same, which often causes confusion. And so, for example, with the Buffalo shooting, he targeted like older people in the shooting, as opposed to in this school shooting, he targeted elementary school kids. And so here's where the confusion came, because obviously we feel a way about this mass shooting, and then you go and shoot up elementary school, and you know how people feel about kids, especially if you have children. And so you have these conflicting feelings of like, I do feel sad that he shot up older people. And then some people are like, but these are kids, man, these are kids. So now you have these conflicting feelings of confusion, and you're like, yo, like, I don't really know how to feel, which causes another grief inside of itself. So now you're accumulating another grief of like this feeling of confusion as to why maybe one feels heavier than the other, even though collectively we were still grieving anyway, and we were anticipating this to happen anyway. So why am I confused that this happened so close to, right? So there's a lot of confusion about that, because honestly, majority of the world is experiencing a cumulative grief. Because let's talk about the pandemic, right? So we're all chilling in life, we're living life, woo, life. Then 2020 happens, and then everything shuts down. So we all experience our own specific type of griefs, whether it's the isolation that came from it, whether it's divorces, whether it's death, whether it was, we were all experiencing this collective type of grief, right? So then we're like, okay, all right, like we're all grieving. We're fully aware of that. So now we're anticipating something to happen, whether it's us being back on lockdown, so we're scared of that, or whether it's from the vaccine, we're scared of that, or whether it's from, the presidency, we're scared of, right? Like we're anticipating whatever that grief is. So then something else happens. We never really fully process 2020. I don't know if a lot of people fully process the grief that they experienced in their life from 2020. And we're in 2022. And I'm just being honest. I think a lot of people just kind of kept it moving, and we're hoping the world opens back up so they can go back to their distractions that they were having prior to that, right? But I don't know if people fully process the grief that came from that, whether it was a grief of losing your identity and becoming a new person, whether it was actually like losing someone, whether it was losing a job. I don't know if people fully process that. So now something else happens. The world happens. All of this stuff with Black Lives Matter happens. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all these deaths that are happening, then all these mass shootings. Like we're just accumulating this grief on top of each other, 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 and we're never processing it. And that's how grief can be dangerous. Grief can be dangerous if you don't process it and it just keeps accumulating, right? And so you're like, I don't understand why I'm feeling this way, because some of these things didn't happen specifically to me, but I still feel that heaviness of it because you never processed it. And it's okay for you to process a collective grief, even if it didn't specifically happen to you. Again, the mass shooting didn't specifically happen to me. I didn't know anyone who was connected to that, but I processed how I felt about it, right? The school shooting didn't happen directly to me. I didn't know anyone directly in that, but I still processed that I felt sad about these children going to school and that nothing will change, and watching things happen and kids being afraid to go to school. I'm like, we did tornado drills in school. These kids are doing like, I don't even know what it's called, but basically they're preparing for like a mass shooting drill. These are children. Like these are children. And these are people who are going to the grocery store just trying to shop, and they're getting killed. These are people in church getting shot and getting killed. Like it's just the amount of grief that is happening in the world, and it's just piling on top of each other. We have to take care of ourselves. And so I have a few tips here. These are in no particular order. I think I have, how many? I have 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 7 here that will hopefully help you, in this kind of collective grief, this anticipatory grief, this cumulative grief that we're all experiencing as a world. To be honest with you, I think the world has just been, it's always been a crazy place, right? But really since 2020, I feel like it's just got turned, I don't even know which way. Like it's gotten wild. And so the first thing that I would say is to allow yourself to feel it. And when I mean it, I mean grief. Allow yourself to feel it. Allow that grief to come in. Like allow yourself to feel whatever stage of grief that it is, even if it's, again, that collective grief, or you're anticipating that grief, or it's grief piling on top of each other, causing that cumulative grief. Feel it. Whatever it feels like. If it's anger, let it be anger. Do you feel it in your shoulders? Feel it in your shoulders. Do you feel it in your neck? Do you feel it in your stomach? Do you feel it in your lungs? Right? There's a whole bunch of studies, and maybe I'll have somebody come on and kind of dive into that about grief obviously affecting your body, but like what it can do to your nervous system, what it can do to your brain, what it can do to, people have body aches all the time, right? Because they're experiencing some type of grief. I've even read about grief, like how it can touch your lungs, and that's happened to me before. Like I would wake up. I remember specifically a time, I want to say it might have been like a year after my dad died, and I literally kept waking up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I would always wake up like like trying to catch my breath. And so then I started like doing some research, and it was talking about, I think, was it 5 o'clock? It was 4 o'clock. I can't remember, but either way, it was like in the middle of the night, and it was talking about your lungs and how you carry grief in your lungs. And so it was like, well, if you're experiencing this and you're waking up breathless and things like that, you're probably carrying some type of grief. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And so then I started doing the work to help myself sleep through the night. So understanding like, oh, you're probably not processing it. You're probably trying to hold it in or suppress it or whatever it is that you're doing. And that's why you're waking up like that. So let's try and work through that and process it, right? So feel it. Allow yourself to feel it so you can understand what that is. And you're like, oh, this is grief happening. Okay, let me try and work through that, right? And so that kind of leads to the next one is making that space for grief. So once you feel it and you recognize what it is, make the space for it. And I know that doesn't sound sexy. I know that's not fun. I know nobody wants to hear all that, but you have to make space for it. You literally have to make space for grief because it's going to be here. Again, collectively as a nation, we are grieving. Collectively in the world, we are grieving. So you have to make space for it. If you're going to try and like put it over here, you're going to try and put things in the way so it doesn't happen, you can't do that. You literally have to make space for the grief. Allow it to come in. And I'm not saying make a big space in your life like, okay, grief, you can have this king size bed and I'll sleep on the twin. No, give that little sucker a day bed. Right? Give that little sucker a day bed, but let it come in, do its thing, let you feel just good enough so you can move forward in your day, in your life, in your week, whatever it is, in your month, right? But you have to make space for it. So don't try and like push it out. Don't try to suppress it. Don't try and fill that space with all of these other coping mechanisms, whether it's alcohol, sex, drugs, work, family, whatever it is, right? Don't try and fill it with all those things. Make some space for it. Let it come in and let it do its thing so that you can move forward in a healthy way. And then also with that, kind of making that space is understand like you need to set some boundaries, right? And I don't mean with just others, I mean with yourself. Set some boundaries with yourself and set them with others. So, like, again, in this kind of collective grieving space, maybe certain things you can't just watch. Like, there's certain videos of like the mass. I think they showed videos of like the shooter in the grocery store. I didn't watch that because that's triggering, right? Like that's triggering for me. And I'm like, Loryn, you got to know yourself and you have to set a boundary within yourself that even though, yes, like you're looking at this person crazy, like you cannot do that to yourself because that might send you into a place that you don't want to go, right? So set those boundaries within yourself and with others. So if people are like, oh my God, so what did you think about the school shooting? You're like, I can't talk about that right now. Because of course, obviously I'm in a space where, I talk about grief a lot. So a lot of people really ask my opinion about it. And so I was able to speak on it. But if I was like, I don't have an opinion on it because right now it's a bit too much for me to kind of process and move through, that's okay too. That's okay too. Sometimes you just have to set those boundaries for yourself. Sometimes you just have to like give yourself a minute. And again, with others, just letting people like, hey, I can't do that, right? But setting those boundaries for yourself, setting those boundaries for others or, with others is going to allow you the proper space to grieve and allow you again, making that space for grief and to feel it. Because if you don't have boundaries and you're just watching like mass murder videos, or if you're allowing people to talk to you about it when it kind of is cringy to you or you don't feel a type of way, then you're never going to be able to allow yourself to grieve. So you have to set boundaries not only with others but also for yourself as well. And then the fourth thing, what was that, third? Yeah, 1 2 3. So the fourth thing is, of course, my favorite, which is therapy, right? So, I know I talk about therapy a lot, but it literally changed my life and I mean it. And so, going to therapy and talking to your therapist about like, hey, like, I don't know why I feel this way. I know there's some type of collective grief going on, but how do I like work through that? Or why does this collective grief that I'm feeling make me feel so heavy? Make me feel like it's hard for me to work through the day, or make me feel like that I can't have a conversation without breaking down. Like going to a therapist who can help you understand the tools that you already have inside of yourself, because a good therapist is going to let you know the tools that you already have inside of yourself, right? And so, you heard at the beginning of this episode, I was talking about BetterHelp, the partnership that I have with BetterHelp now, because again, I want everybody to have access to therapy. And what I love about BetterHelp is that they have affordable, access to therapy. It's affordable for everybody. It's accessible. It's from your phone. You can literally type in everything, and you get 10% off. As you heard earlier, you get 10% off just by being a listener of this You Shall Suck podcast. And so why not just give it a try? Give it a try, see how it works for you. But you definitely should go and just talk about it and just see. Because again, a good therapist is literally going to unlock the things that you already have inside of you. A therapist is not going to tell you you need to do X, Y, and Z. A good therapist is going to really just kind of, ask you questions, understand you, really listen to you, right? Because it's easy sometimes to say, oh, well, I can just talk to my family, I just talk to my spouse. But sometimes you just need an unbiased opinion of someone who can literally help you understand you. And because as much as our family, friends, spouses, know us and understand us, sometimes it's hard for us to understand us. And sometimes it's easier to have that unbiased opinion of someone who doesn't know you starting out to help you understand you. Because someone who knows you sometimes can, even if you're having a conversation, because they know you, they feel like there's certain ways that you can act or certain things that you should do. And that's why sometimes grief can be tricky talking to other people, because you're used to me operating in one way, but right now I'm operating in a grief space and you don't know what to do with that. And you're trying to give me advice on how I would typically operate in a normal space, but I'm operating in a grief space and they're totally different, right? And so I would definitely suggest going to therapy. And then indulge in self-care. Seriously, like take a minute to yourself, go get a massage, get your nails done, sit in silence, binge watch your shows, eat your favorite food, like indulge in that self-care, because that's going to help in that collective grief. Like even having a moment of, because you turn on the news, you're hearing something crazy every day, right? But even just having a moment of like, you know what, I'm going to go get a massage today and I'm not going to think about anything that's going on in the news. I'm not going to think about anything that's going on in work. I'm not going to think about anything that's going on in my life. And just doing that, taking yourself to a nice restaurant, again, just sitting in quiet sometimes, listening to your favorite music. It doesn't have to be anything like super crazy, but just taking a moment to yourself to take your mind off of all of the craziness that's going on in the world, even if it's just for a moment, even if it's for 30 minutes, even if it's for an hour, even if it's for 10 minutes, right? Just taking that time to indulge in yourself is going to help you in your grieving journey, because the world is not going to stop. The craziness in the world is not going to stop. So the least you can do for yourself is take a moment for yourself to take some self-care and indulge in that before you dive back into the world that is literally collectively grieving. And so with that, also accept the joy that comes after it, because again, when you're doing those little things of self-care, you're going to have some joy in that moment. So accept that, because I always tell people that guilt and grief are kissing cousins, right? Because there's so much going on in the world, right? People lost their children, people lost their grandparents, their mothers, their fathers, right? But you're like, oh my God, well, my child is graduating today, but you feel guilty that your child gets to graduate when somebody just lost their child a week ago in a mass shooting, right? But it's okay for you to accept that joy in your life, because that's normal. Because again, unfortunately, the thing about grief that we have to realize is that even though you feel like your world has stopped, everyone else's does not stop. And joy, it's okay to have joy. It's okay to still be happy. You don't have to be guilty about that, because grief is going to be there. It's going to be there. So there's no need for you to sit in the heaviness of it, and to accept and be excited about those moments, right? Because again, like if your child graduated, but meanwhile somebody lost their child and just buried their child, it's okay. It is okay for you to feel, sad about that, but also joyful over here, because they can coincide. They can coincide. Like sadness and joy can coincide, just like grief and guilt. Again, kissing cousins, they try and coincide, right? But all that is that guilt and that grief trying to bring you back to that place of that cumulative grief, as opposed to the joy is letting you process it to say, I do feel sad. I really feel sad for this parent that they had to bury their child. And I feel sad that somebody lost their mother, but I also feel joyous that and thankful that my child is still here. They can coincide, and that doesn't make one better than the other. That doesn't negate what happened over here. That doesn't make you a terrible person for feeling that way, right? So allow yourself to accept that joy as it comes after those moments, those heavy, heavy moments of grief. And then the last thing I would say, is make space for others to encourage healing together. Because at the end of the day, in this collective grief, in this anticipatory grief, in this cumulative grief that we're all feeling, we have to make space for each other because we all have to heal together. So whether that's publicly mourning, right, and saying, man, I feel really sad about what's happening in the world, what's happening with COVID, what's happening with all the mass shootings, what's happening with racism, what's happening with insert whatever it is, right? Make space for others to be able to say, I feel the same way. So we can start the healing process together. Because if you haven't learned anything about me, about the show, about, this whole journey that I'm on, it's that none of us are alone in our grieving journey, right? And so it's important for us to make space for each other so we can help each other heal. Because if people feel alone, if they feel like they're out on an island, then a lot of times that isolation doesn't allow them to process their feelings because they're like, well, nobody understands. Like, nobody's super sad. Like, yeah, they were sad for a day, but now they've moved on with their lives. But it's like, no, we all feel sad. We're all collectively grieving. We all feel this heaviness, but we're also trying to accept the joy that comes from it. We're also trying to process it. We're also trying to make space for it, right? We're also trying to set boundaries and go to therapy and do all these things, right? And so making that space for others to say, listen, I feel the same way. I may not understand necessarily how you feel because maybe your feeling with the grief may be a little different, but I get it and I feel you and I want to make space for you just like I hope you make space for me so we can all heal from this together, right? And so, again, I just wanted to really just tie all those together because we all, just as a nation, as a world, I just feel like there's been this heaviness that's been going around. God, like I said, since 2020, I feel like, again, there's always been craziness in the world, but really since 2020, there's just been this really thin veil of collective grief. And then sometimes it gets really thick and then it kind of thins out, then it gets thick again, So I feel like it was really important for me to come on and talk about that and to help you understand that you're not alone in that and that heaviness that you're feeling is normal. And you're not crazy for feeling that way, even if you aren't fully, connected to whatever the said trauma is that's happening in the world, right? And I know you're anticipating the next thing that happens because you don't see any changes. You don't see, any moving forward or progression or anything like that. And so you're like, well, what is it? Like, let's just get to it, right? And so listen, I get it. I completely understand. And I understand that you also have some cumulative grief that you need to work through as well. And I hope that those tips that I gave you will help you release yourself, right? Release that and understand that you're not alone in that feeling and it's totally normal. It's not weird to feel that way. It's okay if you feel that way. And if you want to talk about it, I'm here to talk about it. And again, creating that space for others to talk about it and to raise your hand and to say, yeah, I think it's weird and I don't know. It's bringing up some other moments in my life and it's because it's just accumulating on top of each other because you've been anticipating some type of grief. You didn't have a chance to heal from the other one and you already have all this grief going on in the world. All right, grief. It's a tricky little something. Grief is a tricky little son of a gun. Okay, it's a little just it's a little So listen, as I always say, as I always in every show, as you're trying to work through this collective grief, as you are setting those boundaries, as you are creating and making that space for that grief, as you are creating the space to heal, as you're going to therapy, as you're doing all of those things, trying not to anticipate that grief that's coming and trying to work through all the cumulative grief that you have, right? As you're going through the process, as you're understanding and learning and working through it and healing, right? Because all of this is healing. Be kind to yourself and give yourself grace because if you don't, who will? That's it, you guys. That is it for another week's episode of This Too Shall Suck podcast, a fresh perspective on grief. If you haven't already, follow me on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, and on LinkedIn at This Too Shall Suck podcast. Or if you don't have social media, definitely feel free to shoot me an email at hello@thistooshallsuckpodcast.com. I love responding and talking to each and every one of you. You all are my family. And again, we're all collectively grieving together. So anything that I can do to help, I'm here. This episode and every episode is produced by my amazing producer, Mike Sick. And this episode, all of the music that you hear, any music that you hear in any episode is produced by Jimmy Samaj. As always, I love you so, so much. I'm sending you love and light in your life because you deserve it. I'll see you on the next episode. Mwah. All right, my loves, I hope you all enjoyed that episode. You can actually listen to This Too Shall Suck podcast, a fresh perspective on grief, on all listening platforms. And make sure, if you're not already, following me on social media on Instagram and on Facebook at This Too Shall Suck podcast. And you can hit my website as well, learn more about your girl, Loryn Denise, at www.thistooshallsuckpodcast.com. If you love this episode, if it resonated with you, make sure you hit that like button. Let me know, because I know I need to make more videos like that for you. And meet me in the comments. Let's talk about it. I love, love, love talking to y'all. And make sure you definitely hit that little bell, that little subscribe button. Thank you guys as always, and I'll see you on the next episode.